Yeah, hello there. Thanks, Sheridan, for that. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land we meet today, and also all on the reefs that I work and play on as well. So I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, emerging, past, present. Sorry, I got mixed up there in my acknowledgement. I always get nerves at these things. Okay, first of all, what I really want to talk to today is about the long-term, juvenile crown-of-thorns research and control program that I set up at Reef. It's been operating for around about 10 years or so. So as you all know, large concentrations of crown-of-thorns starfish in small areas, they reduce coral cover drastically. So in the small scales of tourism sites, you've got socio-economic consequences, not to mention localised loss to biodiversity. So in the last few decades, tourism operators have invested in crown-of-thorns starfish control, as ways of improving their site stewardship, but also trying to improve that localised resilience of the area. The work I want to talk today is about our pontoon site situated on Marine World at Reef. So Reef's around about 50 kilometres east of Cairns, about 10 kilometres in from the continental edge. Reef, around about the turn of the century, like most regions, like most reefs in the Cairns region, was experiencing a crown-of-thorns starfish outbreak. So collection methods at that time, or control methods at that time, were usually by hook or that multi-shot injection method. About the middle of that decade, we noticed crown-of-thorn numbers were decreasing, pretty well what we call a non-outbreak reef. But our monitoring programs around towards the end of that decade started to notice increases in crown-of-thorns starfish abundance. So in 2010, the Australian Marine Park Tourism Operators COTS Control Program, that was reborn as a trainee program. Now we used those trainees on Marine World in between 2010 and 2012 just to control the increasing numbers of COTS at our site. To give you a little bit of a look at that data that's coming up, hopefully I'll press the right button. There we go. So these nice bar graphs here, they show you the COTS, their monthly counts, monthly COTS injected for those 3 years between 2010 to 2012. So the little bold number in brackets there is kind of an indication of effort, gives you the number of dives. So the bars are broken into blue and yellow. Yellow represents the juvenile portion of that bar. So the main take-home feature you really want to look when you look at this graph is in those 3 years, you will notice that effort was decreasing, the number of COTS being injected was increasing, and also there was a high proportion of juveniles to the adults. So providing there's nice evidence that there was this constant supply of larvae or pre-settlement or juveniles that are quite successful in this area. Where were we finding these guys? Basically our Marine World site there, we'll find him kind of just straight to the west, just straight to the east. We kind of surveyed all the areas around that kind of main patch of coral off Marine World there. But east and west is where we got the most highest densities. Rubble patch was quite notable. Coral cover between 2010 and 2012 was around about 55-60% coral cover in that east and west. It was increasing though. By around about 2015, it was about 90% coral cover in those two areas, so quite high. So in 2013, I decided to shift our focus and we would just target small juvenile crown-of-thorns starfish. So we hired a gentleman to help us come up with a sampling program as well. Pardon me. So by juveniles, just to touch on that size, I keep talking about juveniles, I'm talking about anything between 5 and 150 millimetres. Now how we find juvenile crown-of-thorns starfish, same way you find adults, by looking at the scars they leave behind on the coral skeleton. So the method we use, it was quite simple, because the thing with crown-of-thorns is we all know they're quite cryptic animals, particularly when they're not outbreak, and that's more so the case for juveniles. Really hard to locate. So the method we use, quite simple, we just would pick an area, east, west or rubble for that day. We'd run a transect, so 60 metres long, run a tape. Then we get 2 divers and we'd offer 3 metres either side of that tape. So we do a belt transect basically. So the divers would thoroughly look over each coral, basically looking for scars and really tiny feeding scars. Once, if we did find a scar, we find a juvenile crown-of-thorns starfish, then we take some notes on size and what kind of corals it was feeding on as well. that photograph there. I put this one in. It's kind of one of our older ones because it just shows you a bit of that coral cover, what it was like around that kind of 2015, 2016 period. So almost like 90% coral cover there. That program between 2014 and 2017 pretty well taken out almost close to about 10,000 juvenile crown-of-thorns starfish, right? And where you see them from the areas here, the majority of them come out of east and west. An indication of effort would be the little bold number underneath in brackets. That's the number of transects that were conducted in those areas. Rubble's quite notable. We do find them in other areas, up on the flats. Mainly on those flats you would find them around around the gutters. That's where you mainly see them there. Have a look at this monthly kind of catch data over those 4 years. What you see is pretty high. It started to decrease around about 2017. But if you look at the main three bar graphs, like I say, what you tend to notice is there's no real spikes in any real bars. So if you look at that one in 2015 around February, you'll notice the effort was twice, right? There was double amount of transects. So just pretty well consistent. They were quite persistent through this whole period, these juvenile cots. Now in the last few years, I've decided to shift the focus a little bit more because numbers have been decreasing, and tried to have a little bit more at the size structure, get an indication of the spawning frequency, how quickly these things might be growing or what kind of cohorts are coming through. So I've got two pretty multifaceted graphs there. You've got 2018 on the left, 2019 on the right. First of all, the number of cots was decreasing, as we saw that trend from 2017. Now we'll focus on the 2018 graph because what I want to show here, if you look, you can see in January there we start to see little cots, and then you see this kind of progression where the actual peak in the bars is growing through those progressive months. But if you look at August, around July, you'll start to see little ones starting to come through again and progressing through to December. And that same kind of pattern is pretty similar again for 2019, although there's at least a number of cots. So it almost looks like you've got two definite cohorts that seem to be moving through in this period. Just with note to 2019, the numbers started to increase in December. And giving it an indication, we were still getting quite a few cots less than 50 millimetres. I should say the mean size of the cots that we were collecting was around about 70 millimetres. I want to bring that into indication because that was definitely the case for January and for February that year. Then COVID happened, of course, so all our sampling got very more sporadic and all over the place. We did get out there, start collecting. Interestingly though, did not find a lot of juvenile cots in those months around September, October. And also the size of the cots we were finding was increasing as well. Our mean size went to 120 millimetres as well. Now, just for this year, we started to increase our sampling a little bit more. And although we haven't got a lot of cots, one thing I do want to say is in this one, I also included the sub-adults that we were finding as well between the 250 mil class, 150, 250. We were getting a lot more of those, where that's indicated the fact that we couldn't keep our normal sampling up. One thing I kind of see, we really do need to get some validation on the age and growth of cots, particularly juvenile cots that are really feeding on coral diets. Talk about what they're feeding on. So out of all those juvenile cots between 2018 and 2020, pretty well found that we found them preying on 13 genera of coral from 9 families, but 95% of them come from Acropora. Now Acropora is a very diverse genus, as we know. To give an indication of what type of Acroporas they like to feed on, I'll just place this graph up here next. So on here you got mean, on the y-axis here you got your mean cot size, plus or minus 1 standard error there. On the bottom we got those different names there that represent the non-taxonomic groups of Acropora. The reason why I choose to go with groups and not with down to the species level, it's a lot easier to train biologists and non-biologists that we use as well, particularly in AMPTO trainees and the Indigenous guides and also the land and sea country ranger groups that we work with too, like the Irukandjis as well. So just to run through those groups, you've got a bit of an understanding what they are. So that first one there, Echinata, or Echinata, whichever way you want to pronounce it, That one's your compound branching, your bottlebrush corals, right? Then you got your Salago and Horita. Now they represent more those fine diameter staghorn corals. Then you're getting on to a Formosa and Robusta. They're more wider diameter staghorn corals. Your next three groups there, I think we got, Nasuda through to Humilis. So you're talking about your digitate or your finger corals. Hyacinthus represents your plates, of course. So what this graph really shows is there's a real clear ontogenetic shift in diet for juvenile cots. So below 70 millimetres, we're pretty well finding them on those bottlebrush corals, right? After that size, they start to graduate to those more simple branching staghorn corals. Now, to give you a little bit of a look at the size structure that comes off, sorry, I meant to put those photographs on, all mixed up today. That's a bottlebrush coral, basically, what we're talking about, those compound branching little fine branches. And of course, most we know our simple branching staghorns. Have a look at the size structure coming off the Echinata group. We can see there we get every size class of juvenile comes out of those bottlebrush corals. We can see those real peaks between 35 and 65 millimetres, kind of where that mean size was. But what I'm really interested in is the juvenile cots from 35 millimetres down. So what we're finding is these guys are kind of switching pretty early from a CCA diet, almost like around that 8-10 mil mark CCA diet to that hard coral diet, right? And this is where I think where we need that really size at age data, particularly when they switch to that coralline diet. These things tend to grow quite fast. Overall, in conclusion, basically this program's been very successful. I mean, we've taken over 13,000 juvenile crown-of-thorn starfish from that area. So it has increased, local resilience. High densities, so we're talking densities greater than 100 individuals per hectare of juvenile cots that are not detectable by your standard monitoring methods. So we don't pick up these numbers in our reef health impact surveys. I doubt you'd get them in mantitos as well. Never done mantitos, but I doubt you would get them. However, eDNA methods in detecting COTS larvae are a good method to determine juvenile crown-of-thorn starfish abundance. Why I say this is for the last 5 years, we've supplied Stan and his team with plankton samples from a continuous time series at our site. And he's analysed those for crown-of-thorn starfish larvae magnitude or abundance. And those spikes in larvae abundance do mirror our spikes in juvenile cot densities as well. Right, so I think these two methods combined are a really good way to like an early warning system, basically get into reefs. So using eDNA combined with fine scale, and you get a good indication if you are starting to see a crown-of-thorn starfish outbreak, and you can put your control efforts towards there. Growth in that year one age bracket, like I say, it appears quite rapid. I keep saying, but it does definitely need some validation. Compound branching acropora corals are very important habitat for those early stage juvenile crown-of-thorns, that's for sure, at this site. Like everything we do in the department I run, basically everything we do from a monitoring and a research point of view, we incorporate that back into our daily stories that we pass on to our valued guest. This has been a big hit really at the end of the day on the way home. The marine biologist, AMPTO trainee, and also our Indigenous cultural guides, they do nice little talks about the beautiful biology of crown-of-thorn starfish, but also kind of a bit about the role they play to, then there's disturbance and recovery processes on coral reefs. I really do have to say a special thank you to the Australian Marine Park tourism operators. I mean, without their help over these last 10 years, this project would have been impossible. So thank you.